healthcare system is broken, but it won't be fixed through the barrel of a gun. It has to happen through legislative and executive action by politicians who are willing to prioritize the concerns of those they were elected to serve instead of the lobbyists whose contributions elected them and keep them in office. Joining me now is Scott Galloway, an NYU professor at the Stern School of Business, host of the podcast Prof G, and author most recently of The Algebra of Wealth, a simple formula for financial security. Love having you here as always, Scott. It's complicated, and I want to say up front, there are two families, right, that are suffering with this tragic outcome.
Yeah, always good to be with you, Michael. Look, the definition of intelligence is the ability to hold two thoughts in your mind at the same time. And this was a gruesome murder, as you articulately pointed out, a lot of loss for the Thompson family. What's also gruesome is a healthcare system that has figured out a way to weaponize government and has healthcare systems, including United, that reject 1/3 of claims. A healthcare system where, despite the fact that we have invented the majority of pharmaceuticals in the world and distribute and manufacture them, we pay on average $1,500 per citizen, and the rest of the world pays $500. A world in which we have the strongest economy in the world, but the number one source of bankruptcy is medical debt. The U.S. consumer healthcare is the biggest business in the world, but it's been optimized, like everything else in the United States, for shareholders. And that is the way you really bring this down to a ground level and explain some of the rage felt by people across America is, in the New York Times, they have that section called Vows, where they highlight and celebrate people who've been recently married. There was one very poignant one, and that is they usually don't allow people, they don't feature people unless they can show proof they have been legally married. And they made an exception for a young woman who decided just to have the ceremony and not be legally married because she is suffering from brain cancer and didn't want to encumber her spouse with medical debt. So the level of anxiety, despair, and distress that the nation and its regulatory capture through our elected representatives have levied on the American public means we really don't have a democracy. We have a capitalocracy, and that is, we do vote for our elected representatives, but it's money. The number one spender on lobbying isn't the defense industry, it's not big tech, it's the healthcare industry. And 2/3 of those lobbyists are former government officials. This is no longer about the nation. Our elected representatives no longer optimize for our nation, they optimize for the NASDAQ.
Can we have this conversation, which I welcome, without glorifying murder?
Gosh, you gotta hope so. I mean, you pointed out, this was a man with two sons. This is not, we can't have our anarchy. You said it perfectly. This problem isn't going to be solved through the barrel of a gun. There's legislation right now from Senators Warren and Hawley, who I would point out are not ideological on the same train a lot. The people before monopoly legislation that tries to de-verticalize insurance companies who control and own some pharmacies, who steer more people to their pharmacies, putting local pharmacies out of business, and then using their heft to negotiate better prices from pharmaceutical companies that they then keep. United Healthcare stock has quintupled in the last 10 years. It's beaten the NASDAQ. And yet 1 out of 3 claims that they received are rejected. This has to be a civil conversation, but I think rage is directed at the wrong place. I think the rage should be directed not only at Washington, but the voters who've decided that America is now a platform where the bottom 90% are responsible for innovating and generating and supporting an economy that's essentially optimized for the top 10% who own 90% of the shares. And the notion that somehow the CEOs of these companies are going to call on their better angels and start thinking long-term about the health and welfare of the Commonwealth. Don't hold your breath, Michael. I've been on the board of 7 public companies and a bunch of private companies, and I'm not proud to say this, but there's only one criteria for a CEO, and that is getting the share price up.
The CEO of the parent wrote for the New York Times. I'm going to put on the screen and I'll read aloud just one paragraph that caught my eye. He said, this is Andrew Whitty. He said, "We know the healthcare system does not work as well as it should, and we understand people's frustrations with it. No one would design a system like the one we have, and no one did, It's a patchwork built over decades. How can we be doing it different? You have this experience of being abroad, of having lived there for a brief time period. What's the model? What should come from this?
We pay double per person, $13,000, what other G7 nations pay. On average, they pay $6,500. And in exchange for that, we have worse outcomes. So here in the UK, while the NHS has its issues, you have universal coverage. 70% of America, Michael, wants universal coverage and price caps, and yet they never happen because see above, the number one lobbying group. Realistically, we're not overnight going to have universal health care. I like the idea of taking Medicare down a couple of years every year until everyone's covered by it. But at the end of the day, we have to hold our elected officials accountable and say, how much money are you taking from the pharmaceutical and the health industrial complex? We talk about an axis of evil being Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I'll give you an axis of evil in the United States, the industrial food complex that puts all this dyes and pesticides and preservatives in our food. The first thing I noticed in London is that food actually rots. Why? Because there are 1,100 chemicals they don't allow in our food. The result is 70% of Americans are obese or overweight. And then they hand them over to the medical industrial complex where they make $13,000 per citizen. So again, is America about serving the people or is it about serving shareholders? The top 10% benefit from this system because we own 90% of the shares. But until we start electing a democracy, a democratic government that represents the bottom 90, and we get rid of Citizens United, where it's no longer just about shareholders are wagging the entire dog of the nation here, and it manifests in some very ugly ways, including a healthcare industrial complex where pharmaceutical companies are spending $88 billion on R&D and $100 billion on marketing, on lobbying. So obviously they're optimizing for shares. The for-profit incentive we have in this nation above all else is having terrible externalities, including healthcare.
Two reactions. One, you're sounding like Bobby. Not necessarily a bad thing, but a lot of what I just heard from Scott Galloway, I know I've heard from Robert F. Kennedy Jr. And the second observation is I'd love to have this dialogue about whether we should go to some other type of system, single payer. But I remember well what the climate was like when President Obama had this plan to create exchanges, very Amazon-like, and allow people to go on and purchase private health insurance, and it was derided as socialism, and people hung Gadsden "Don't Tread on Me" flags. So I don't know that the American people, as upset as they are with the current system, have the stomach for that political battle. Your thoughts?
Not only do they have the stomach, but do they have the desire? American superpowers are optimism. But the reality is the bottom 90% are there to optimize the top 10%. And the strange thing, Michael, is I believe the bottom 90% understands it and supports it because they believe at some point they might be in the top 10%. So we have decided that the most anxious, obese, depressed generation of young people in history, people who have claims for wheelchairs for their recently paralyzed kids being rejected, we have decided to accept that and normalize it such that the NASDAQ reaches new highs. We're no longer optimizing for the nation, we're optimizing for the NASDAQ. And if you want to be enraged at someone, look at the man in the mirror. We continue to vote for people who will delay and obfuscate any healthcare reform if they get money from the healthcare industrial complex such that they can get reelected. We chose this system. We're not victims of this. We're the culprits. We have purposely opted for a system that shoves money from the bottom 90 and despair. We trade despair and distress at the bottom 90 such that the top 10 can get wealthier and wealthier. And we have chosen this system. We have chosen not an economy, not in a society, but a Hunger Games-like platform called America.
I appreciate you. I probably won't have the privilege of having you on the program between now and the end of the year. So although you're in my special, you are in my special in between Christmas and New Year's. So I wanted to say thank you for all the appearances that you've made with me here this year. Thank you, Scott.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate your courage and your willingness to just take truth to power. Happy holidays to you and yours.